So before I get into the main topic of this video, I just want to say a big thank you to you guys for being patient. As you can see, the uploads have gone, they've come to a halt almost. Not completely, but almost, because I'm just so busy these days, guys. I've got so many projects that I'm working on, so many different things that I'm having to attend to, and taking the time to make videos for you guys. You know, it's hard to fit it into the day, but bear with me. There is content coming. I'm going to try be as active as I reasonably can. So yeah, just a bit of housekeeping, just to let you know, to let you guys know that I am okay. Everything's fine, but I'm just insanely busy. So thank you for your patience. Thank you for bearing with me. Anyway, on to the main event of this weekend. I think it's fair to say that this is the most high-profile fight, even though it's still fairly low-key. But it's the biggest fight of the weekend, I feel. And this is Vergil Ortiz versus Michael McKinson. This fight will be taking place on Saturday in Texas. That's where Ortiz hails from. This fight was actually supposed to happen a few months back, I believe in March, if memory serves me correctly. But Ortiz actually pulled out due to developing rhabdo. For those who don't know, rhabdo is just a short colloquialism for rhabdomyolysis, or myolysis, however you want to pronounce it. And that is a condition that is very serious, actually. And it's fairly common. It doesn't take much, or it's common amongst people who train and sometimes go into the realm of overtraining, which I don't think is particularly unheard of for a young fighter like Ortiz, who you would imagine is fully invested in his training. You can Google rhabdo and see for yourself, but it's actually a condition where, due to the overtraining, the muscles actually start to break down. They become so damaged that their proteins, they seep into the bloodstream, and it can cause a lot of complications and be potentially fatal. So yeah, a lot of people these days are skeptical and suspicious of reasons why fighters pull out. But I think the fact that rhabdo is something that's common amongst people who train intensely and very often, as Ortiz does, in heat too. I imagine that he does a lot of his training in Texas, and I don't think the climate in Texas is very forgiving. And on top of that, he is still fighting McKinson. It's just been pushed back a bit. So I'm not really suspicious of that pullout. If you guys have any rumors or anything like that, maybe something's been happening in sparring and you think that plays a part in this fight, leave it down below. But I'm not privy to that. So as far as I'm concerned, it's a legitimate pullout and reschedule, and the fight's happening this Saturday anyway. So as a result of this, Ortiz has been out of the ring for almost a year exactly. His last fight was in last August, and that was a stoppage victory over Mean Machine Kavaliauskas. And that's a good victory, in my opinion, for a young fighter to have, especially because Kavaliauskas, he's no slouch. Yeah, he lost to Crawford, but he gave Crawford a tough fight, and he's a very dangerous fighter, very strong, powerful, got good skills, very refined, and very much at the peak of his powers, I think Kavaliauskas is. And Ortiz beat him in a pretty entertaining fight. McKinson went on to fight a late replacement. This is back in March. And that was Alex Martin, who I believe is actually fighting on the undercard of this fight. That fight, nothing happened at all. It was a late replacement. You have to factor that in. But that fight, honestly, if you haven't seen it, really, you're not missing much. That's the kind of fight that puts a glass eye to sleep. And this is a bit of a trend, in my opinion, with McKinson's fights. There's a slight buzz surrounding both of these guys. Ortiz is a prospect who many people have been touting for a while now. They see him as, say, alongside Jaron Ennis, as being kind of the heir apparent to welterweight championship, which I think is fair enough. Those two are the kind of blue chip prospects, if you like, going into contender status. McKinson himself has risen to prominence somewhat after he scored a 10-round unanimous decision over Chris Kongo. That was on the undercard of the Wyatt Povetkin rematch. I think that was last March in 2021. And yeah, like it was a surprising victory. Nobody had really heard of McKinson. I certainly haven't heard of him before that fight. and he came in and he did a job on Chris Kongo, who in his own right was a very talented and highly touted fighter on the British scene as well. But despite this slight buzz surrounding McKinson, I really don't like watching him fight. I have to be honest. And being like really putting it all out there and being as honest as I can, I kind of avoid watching him actively. Like, I really don't like his fights. And I think it comes from his style. He's been fighting less than stellar opposition, but it seems to be McKinson's style. I just think he has an ugly style and it leads to ugly fights. But that being said, I am going to put my personal preferences aside and try and really give as balanced and objective as observation and prediction as I can. Ortiz, he's a fighter who I think he's got some promise. When I look at his style, I see a young fighter, but he doesn't really fall into the mold of many other young fighters in the sense that there's no special effects. He doesn't seem to go too far out of his way to look flashy, and we see a lot of young professional fighters in their early 20s, and they want that flair before they've necessarily mastered the science of boxing. With Ortiz, I don't see that. He's very straight up and down, if that makes sense. Very ordinary, almost, in a sense that there isn't much pizzazz and not much jumps out at you. No special effects, as I say. But he has very strong, very consistent technique. If you look at him on the pads, on the bags, when he's fighting, his technique is very, very solid. He doesn't have any punches or movements that look weak and underdeveloped. It's all very consistent. And I think it's good. That's a good way for a young fighter to start, because the flair he can add later as he becomes a more seasoned pro. And because of this very strong and consistent technique, as long as he is in punching range, he's actually quite dangerous. Because, as I say, there's never a punch or a position that he can't work with. So if he's in range, he can make you miss, he can make you pay, and he has a wide selection of shots that all have a decent amount of force behind them. I don't think he's the biggest one-punch knockout artist, but I think he's got good enough power and he's very accurate and he punches very correctly. He can rush his punches at times, though. Sometimes he will just wing a shot in, and there's nothing wrong with that per se, because sometimes it'll pay off. However, at the highest level, you need that setup, because you're fighting guys who, they've been boxing for a long time. They're very experienced. They're at the top of their games. And you can't just rush a professional fighter and hope to land a punch. You have to set it up. You have to use some intelligence. So there are times where the setup of Vergil Ortiz could be a bit more consistent. And I think there is room for him to be a little bit more adventurous. Sometimes it is just a little bit ordinary. But as I say, that may come with time. One thing I've noticed about Vergil Ortiz is he does make a concerted effort to move his head. Now, it's not large amounts of head movement, it's just subtle at most of the time, just to take himself off of the center line, use his eyes to look for shots, and bring his body into a different position to give his opponent a different look and find the shot. But his hand placement is very static. He has the earmuffs glued to his face, and I'd like to see that head movement just coupled with a change in hand placement, just to keep the hands moving, get some momentum going through the hands, and allow them to accelerate a bit more of those setup shots, which will help him to land power shots. So that's Ortiz in a nutshell. I feel those are the things, the features of his style that I feel play the biggest part in his fights. McKinson, on the other hand, he also has quite a decent active guard. He has a very relaxed posture. He fights with a lot of confidence. For someone who doesn't have very many knockouts, he is quite confident in the ring. He has a relaxed posture, and I feel that kind of psychs out his opponents sometimes. It's a bit of a subliminal psychological trick where you see it often, where a fighter will drop their hands and they completely dispense with using their hands as defense because they're so far away from their face. And you think this would be a prime opportunity for the opponent to rush in. But it's like a psychological trick. It's subliminal, where you think this is too good to be true. not only do the hands go out of the peripheral vision of the opponent, but you kind of you slow yourself down, you double take, you think, right, if I go in, this guy's definitely going to attack me. He's luring his opponents in, and so combined with that law of that relaxed posture and lowering his hands, McKinson does counter well with single shots, and they're not the prettiest shots. His technique is, he doesn't have much power. He scores a lot of knockdowns, but I think that's more of the timing. He has like an awkward timing that he's able to catch people with. But the power, his technique is quite underdeveloped. And if you actually slow down McKinson's fights when he's throwing these single counter punches, sometimes he slaps with his hooks, or he lands with the fingers on his straight punches, and that's the reason why he just isn't a big puncher. However, the timing and the sharpness of his counters in terms of the speed and how good his reflexes are, it does a good job of making his opponents gun shy. And so you can see how when he fights people and decent opposition, not the best, but decent, they become very low volume and their punching output is very low, because McKinson, to his credit, does a good job of making it low. He has this kind of reserved defensive approach, and he can be difficult to hit, but I think his problem comes where he does a good job of making you miss, but when he makes you pay, because his technique is underdeveloped, he can get hit himself. So it's a bit like he's good as long as he's not punching you, he's not offending you, not trying to counter you, but as soon as he tries to, he potentially loses that advantage, that defensive advantage. So comparing these two, I think early on, I wouldn't be surprised to see McKinson actually land a few decent counters on Ortiz, who, as I say, can sometimes wing his shots in, sometimes be a little bit ordinary in the setup. But I think as soon as Ortiz sees that the counters maybe aren't as powerful, and he feels it for himself, I think he will look to pressure McKinson a bit more. And I just think the consistency and the strength of Ortiz's technique, it's going to highlight a gap in class between himself and McKinson. And I don't think McKinson's defense is really deep enough. I don't think he has enough defensive layers to hold off Ortiz. So I'm not sure how entertaining a fight this will be, but I am very much in the camp of people who think eventually the gap in class will show, and it will be in favour of Vergil Ortiz, who just has better technique all around, and can maybe be a bit straight up and down, but I think eventually he will get to McKinson. I imagine McKinson's tough. I imagine he's tough. He looks like the kind of guy who can probably take a shot fairly well. That being said, I can see this fight going late, maybe 9, 10, 11. But I do think around those kind of rounds, getting to the 9th, getting to the 10th and the 11th, and I think Ortiz will be putting enough hurt on McKinson to get him out of there, maybe force like a corner stoppage or force the referee to jump in. But I imagine McKinson's fired up for it, so he'll probably protest. But I think he'll be taking too many punches from Ortiz, who has got a wide variety and some very good technique. So yeah, I'm going for Vergil Ortiz stoppage between rounds 9 and 11. So that's just my opinion. Let me know what you think down below. This fight, before I close out this video, it's actually got a decent co-main event as well. It's got Maurice Hooker versus Blair Cobbs. Maurice Hooker has kind of been in the wilderness. He's suffered a couple of stoppage losses to Ortiz, I believe. That fight was a long time ago, I think. But Ortiz, Hooker has always had a style that I've liked, but he's a bit chinny. His punch resistance really isn't there. But Blair Cobbs, I don't know if Blair Cobbs is that big a puncher to the point where he'd be able to exploit it. I think if he hit Hooker enough, he'd be able to. But I think that's an interesting fight. And Blair Cobbs, he talks a good game, but his fight game is not up to scratch, and he found out the hard way in his last fight. So I think that's an interesting fight. But obviously the main event is the main draw. So let me know what you think of this fight down below. Do you agree with my take? Do you disagree? Leave it down below and I'll get back to you. What's your prediction for this fight? Are you even looking forward to this fight? Or like me, do you think that McKinson's fights are, yeah, less than stellar? Leave it down below, I'll get back to you. And thanks as always. I'll catch you in the next video.